The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "That would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of the men who had eaten was 5,000. The word of the Lord. A few years ago, a man named Arnold Abbott made the headlines for setting up an operation in a Florida park to feed those in need. You might remember this. Abbott worked with 2 local preachers, and he caused quite a stir with what he was doing, particularly because he was, at that time, 90 years old, and he defied the authorities by continuing to feed those in need, despite being arrested several times. I love this guy. They'd put him in jail, and as soon as he got out, he'd go right back to feeding the hungry. The first time I heard about Arnold Abbott, I immediately pictured this scene from Mark's Gospel. Thousands of people are crowded around our superhero, Jesus, and the disciples, all of them tired and hungry, all of them in need. Now, aside from the resurrection, the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 is the only miracle recorded in all 4 Gospels. So obviously, the Gospel writers considered this a significant miracle. Now, we're studying the story today out of Mark's Gospel, as we are all of the stories in this series. But it's interesting to note, and this is what Keith was talking about before, in Matthew, his accounting of this story adds the interesting tidbit that 5,000 did not include any of the women and children who were there. Women and children didn't count. Don't get me started on that. But my point is that many Bible scholars believe that the actual number of people fed that day was more like somewhere between 15 and 20,000. So as I did last week, I am claiming this story as hardcore proof that Jesus of Nazareth is a true superhero. Now let's look at this story a little more closely. Jesus and the disciples had been walking around and teaching crowds of people, as they always did, and they were tired and they were hungry. And Jesus finally said to the disciples, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they got into a boat and they went away to what the scriptures call a solitary place. Some versions call it a remote place. And we don't know exactly where this was, but the fact that it was solitary figures into the story. So when they got to their solitary place, what happened? A crowd had gotten there ahead of them, right? I always feel sorry for Jesus and the disciples at this point in stories like this. They're exhausted, they're hungry, and they just can't get a moment alone. Jesus, however, doesn't seem to feel sorry, at least not for himself. And when he sees the crowd has followed them, the scriptures tell us he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So there's already a feeding theme going on here, isn't there? Their spirits are hungry. It's the reason that they're not willing to let Jesus get away. And our superhero doesn't sigh or roll his eyes or ask if he can't just get a few minutes peace here, please. He knows they're following him, and he knows he can't turn them away. They are like sheep without a shepherd. So when it gets to be later in the day, the disciples realize they got a problem. They're in a very remote location, and no one has food. And remember, the scripture says even Jesus and the disciples hadn't eaten. Now here's where the miracle starts, and it gets really interesting. The disciples tell Jesus to send the people into the surrounding villages to buy themselves something to eat. Makes sense, right? There's no food around. People are hungry. It's a logical suggestion. But once again, the disciples, bless their hearts, underestimate our superhero. And Jesus, I love this, says to them, you give them something to eat. Can you just imagine the disciples' faces like... Now let's sit with that for a moment and think about what Jesus is doing here. This is the man who turned water into wine. He could have rustled them up a little something. He could have said, no problem, I got this. He doesn't. Instead, he says to the disciples, you do it. So the disciples, I love these dudes so much, still didn't say to each other, guys, this is Jesus. Let's see where he's going with this. No. They immediately start protesting that what Jesus told them to do was basically impossible. They can't afford that, they tell him. That would cost a half a year's wages. You want us to spend that much on bread to feed all of these people? No way, Jesus. No can do. Now, the version of this that we read doesn't give an exact monetary amount, but other gospel versions of this story say that the disciples estimated that it would cost them about 200 denarii to buy that much bread. So for our comparative purposes, one denarius, represents a laborer's daily wage. So the disciples are telling Jesus here that 200 denarii is a sum that is just way out of reach. They don't have that kind of money, and they for sure don't have time to go out and earn that kind of money. But Jesus knows there has to be food somewhere in the crowd. The scriptures don't say how he knew this or whether he just assumed it, because when you're in a crowd, there's always somebody who brought snacks. So he sends the disciples out into the crowd to see what they can find. And when they come back, they report that they found 5 loaves of bread and 2 small fish. Now, Mark doesn't say who had this food, but other gospel versions specify that it was a young boy. So knowing that, as Keith said earlier, we can assume that these were not giant loaves of bread that this boy was toting around. If he had 5 loaves on him plus 2 fish, they had to have been fairly small. I always assumed they were like individual portions, something his mother had packed for him to take on his wanderings. At any rate, this is what the disciples come back and tell Jesus. And Jesus says, okay, great, that's perfect. And he has everyone sit down in groups on the green grass. Now, I want to pause right here and point out that this little detail is absolutely fascinating to me. Mark is not big on physical descriptions, so the fact that he mentions the grass being green is not an accident. While I can't say for sure why he points out that the grass was green, my best guess is that he's letting us know what time of year this takes place. So if we read this story in its bigger context, we know that it occurs not too long before Jesus predicts his death. So we can probably assume that this was in the spring, which means it was also close to Passover. And we know that the Last Supper was his Passover observance with the disciples, and we know that breaking and sharing bread is customary for the host of a Jewish meal. Or here's another thought. Maybe the mention of green grass could tie in with the fact that Jesus feels they're like sheep without a shepherd, and sheep feed on grass. And let's not forget that the 23rd Psalm also has a parallel between green grass and God's provisions. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. Now that is unrelated directly to the miracle. I just find it fascinating to look at these details in a bigger context. And I encourage us all to do that when we're reading passages like this. All right, now back to our story. So the people all do as Jesus says. I mean, he's a superhero, you know, they have to do what he says. And they all sit down in groups of 50s or hundreds. Now, this was all very organized and probably safer, since the people wouldn't be stampeding toward Jesus and the disciples looking for food. And it's at this point that Jesus takes the bread and the fish, and he looks up to heaven, and he blesses and breaks the loaves, and he gives them to the disciples to give to the people along with the fish. Now, it's important that we really take in what's happened here. Jesus gives public thanks to God for the food. We know how important this is, and Jesus is showing us here exactly why giving thanks is so important when you receive God's blessings. Because we sometimes forget, don't we? We don't intend to, but we can sometimes get so caught up in our busy lives that we forget to thank God for his blessings. Paul writes about this in the first chapter of Romans, verse 21, when he says, "Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened." And in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 18, Paul tells us to give thanks in everything, for this is the will of God in Jesus Christ for us. So we know the importance of giving thanks. And in this story, Jesus acts this out in living color for thousands of people. And of course, we all know what happens next, don't we? Everyone ate until they were full, and afterward the disciples went around and picked up 12 baskets full of leftovers. Wow, he heals people and he feeds them. Best superhero ever. Now, Keith and I showed you this morning just how small the amount of food was that Jesus was given. Not just anyone can pass around 5 little loaves of bread and 2 small fish and end up with 12 baskets of leftovers. Incidentally, there is a foreshadowing of this miracle in the Old Testament. In the book of 2 Kings, Elijah tells his servant to use 20 loaves of barley to feed 100 men, and the servant says, "How can I set this before 100 men?" But in the end, the same thing happened that we read about in this morning's story from the Gospels. In this story, people not only had enough to eat, they had a lot left over. That is such a God thing. Psalm 132, chapter 15, tells us that God says he will do more than provide for his people. He will give an abundance. And we certainly see that here. Now, I also think it's interesting to note that Jesus fed the people through his disciples. As I said before, our superhero could have just snapped his fingers or waved his arms and brought out food for everyone, like the amazing Mumford used to say on Sesame Street, "A la peanut butter sandwiches." You're supposed to laugh there. Thank you. Thank you. But he didn't do that. Verse 41 tells us that after he blessed the bread and the fish, he gave it to his disciples to hand out to people. So what does that mean? This wasn't Jesus just having them do all the hard work so he could kick back. We know by now that when Jesus does stuff like this, there's a reason. And in this case, I believe there was more than one reason. For one, it was more practical to have the disciples do it. It was done more quickly and more efficiently. There were 12 of them. They could get in and out of the crowds of people quickly. But I think there was another reason, a bigger reason, for having the disciples hand out the food to the hungry people. Jesus was teaching them to trust him. They had to trust him for everything they distributed. Think about that. They could only give what they had received. Remember, what they saw with their own eyes were 5 small loaves of bread and 2 little fish. So when Jesus gives those things back to them and says, "Here, pass this out," they had to have known they were about to be surprised. And I can only imagine how surprised they actually were when they kept going in and out among the crowds with 5 small loaves of bread and 2 fish, and they kept going in and out of these groups of 50 and 100 people, and they never ran out of food. The scene is absolutely breathtaking, and there is no way to describe it other than what it was, a miracle. There's no way that we as humans can rationalize it or apply science or logic to it. It doesn't work. But then again, all the miracles Jesus performed are beyond our capability to understand. But Jesus pulls out this feat of really creative power. And when he does, he reveals proof of his divinity to thousands and thousands of people. Remember, Mark is the gospel with the messianic secret. Jesus is always telling people, don't tell anyone what you've seen. Don't tell anyone who I am. And now, boom, in front of thousands and thousands of people, he performs a miracle. It's also pretty cool when you realize that by not turning them away, when they follow him to the remote location, he is looking after their spiritual side. And then when he performs the miracle of the loaves and fish, he's looking after their physical needs. Now let's jump back to the disciples. They were put in a position of total dependence upon Jesus to supply what they needed. Does that sound familiar? Have we heard that before? We saw this in Exodus, when we read about how God supplied manna from heaven to the Israelites after the food that they took with them from Egypt had run out. And God told Moses to instruct the people to only gather what they needed for each day and not save any of it until morning. And we know what happened when some of them saved it until morning. That's the first time I ever heard what a maggot was. I had to look that up. So God telling the people this serves the same purpose as Jesus telling the disciples to hand out the bread and the fish to the multitudes. It taught them to trust God to supply exactly what they needed. And the disciples were as blessed by this whole thing as anybody. In fact, maybe even more so. They were able to be of service to God, to Jesus, by serving and feeding hungry people. And now we've arrived at the big so what? The point where you're probably thinking, great story, Pastor Christy, but how long are we going to keep circling the airport here? What does this have to do with us? God uses us the same way today. He wants us to trust him, to depend on him, to provide what we need, and what's more, by giving us the opportunity to get involved in our church and in our community. I mean, let's think about that for a moment. We're used to reading these stories in the Bible and thinking, isn't that nice? I love that familiar old story. But this is not just a story in the archives of Christianity. This is being relived again and again today by us. God uses us like he used the disciples to show his love and his grace and his abundance to others. When we donate to the local food bank, this is what we're doing. When we volunteer at the soup kitchen, this is what we're doing. Don't ever think that doing something small for someone doesn't count. It does. It counts the same way 5 small loaves of bread and 2 fish counted. I'm sure that young boy, when he handed over his lunch to the disciples, thought that it wasn't enough to matter. In fact, Keith pointed this out to me. I hadn't thought of this. We already said women and children didn't count. They weren't counted among the number that were in the crowd that day. That means the little boy with the 5 loaves and the 2 fish wasn't counted. Yet the miracle couldn't have happened without him. And he willingly shared what he had, and God blessed it, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was abundant. The disciples had a responsibility to give to the people what Christ had given to them. Arnold Abbott shared what had been given to him. When God gives to us, we are to share faithfully with others, not hoard those gifts for ourselves. And we are so deeply and richly blessed. And what's more, as we talked about last week, we are now Jesus' hands and feet on this earth. But he is still our superhero. When we trust him, when we do what the disciples did and take what he gives us and trust in him, Jesus can still work miracles through us. Tune in next week when our superhero calms the storm and walks on the water, and still without ever putting on tights or a cape. May it be so.